My name is Susan Vine, and I'm a Vice President of the Network for Women's Lives. On behalf of the network and our hardworking co-sponsors, I want to welcome you to a very special event. The network is a volunteer organization dedicated to preventing domestic violence and promoting healthy relationships. Our goal is prevention, our vehicle is education. Our co-sponsors this evening are the Concord Carlisle Domestic Violence Roundtable, the Domestic Violence Services of Central Middlesex, Sudbury Wayland Lincoln Domestic Violence Roundtable, and Violence Prevention Coalition of Bedford. The network is deeply grateful for their contributions and for the outstanding spirit of cooperation that has marked our work together for this event. Before introducing the gentleman and teacher we've all come to hear, I'd like to thank Polly Atwood of the Alcott School, who generously made this venue available to us. And I would also like to thank our location angel, Katie Oates, who discovered it for us. Lundy Bancroft is the author of a number of publications on domestic abuse. His first book was The Batterer as Parent, addressing the impact of domestic violence on family dynamics. His second book was entitled, Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. That book is one of the 2 best-selling books in the country on relationship abuse. His most recent book is entitled When Dad Hurts Mom, Helping Your Children Heal the Wounds of Witnessing Abuse, which addresses the impact on children of exposure to abuse and guides mothers in how to help boys and girls get well and stay well emotionally. Lundy specializes in counseling and legal interventions for abusive men, and he has worked extensively with teen boys who've been exposed to domestic violence. His most current work focuses on men who abuse women and the impact those men have on the lives of both women and children. In his work as author, trainer, counselor, and activist on issues of abuse and recovery, Lundy spends a great deal of time traveling across this country. He tells us he's especially pleased to be speaking in his home state of Massachusetts, and we are absolutely delighted to present him here tonight. Will you please join me in welcoming the remarkable Mr. Lundy Bancroft.
Thank you. That's one of the nicest receptions I've ever had. I feel like I should have some magic tricks ready for the occasion. But it is fun to speak in Massachusetts, and I don't know why I don't get to speak in Massachusetts more often. I think it's partly because for at least the past 5 years, the state has been completely broke. But it is funny to live here, and I've been to Alaska twice, I think, in the last 3 years, and Hawaii, and it's funny that I don't get to speak in Massachusetts. And one of the effects that it has being here is that I notice I keep thinking I recognize everybody in the audience, which I probably don't, but it gives me a sense of having seen people somewhere before. Before I really get into the nitty-gritty of talking about my experience working with men who batter and what I've learned from that and what I hope we in our communities can take from what people in the domestic violence field have learned about domestic violence offenders, is I want to say first that I think we continue in the year 2006 to underestimate the number of lives that are being torn apart by the conduct of battering men. And I am in airports a lot, and it means that I'm constantly being subjected to very loud television sets. And it's getting more and more so the only place you can get away from a television set in an airport is by crawling under your seat in the waiting area. But it means that I get a constant reminder of what people are being constantly reminded of in their homes. And pretty much what it is terrorism. Terrorism, 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 terrorism. Now, I take our safety seriously. I want everybody to be well. I want everybody to be safe. I also believe, though, that in order to keep people safe, you have to prioritize where your greatest risks are. I think that's just sort of common sense about safety. If I, living in Massachusetts, put most of my energy into figuring out how I was going to keep my children from being stung by scorpions, that would not be time terribly well spent. It's just not something that's real likely to happen in Massachusetts, and I've got to focus much more on keeping them from getting hit by cars. Now, in an average year, in the United States, between 1,500 and 2,000 women are murdered by their husbands or boyfriends or their ex-husbands or ex-boyfriends. And in other words, by a domestic terrorist. Coincidentally, that's roughly the number, about 1,600 women died in the World Trade Center demolition. So if we look over the last 5 years, since 9/11, the number of women who have died at the hands of a domestic terrorist in the United States is 5 times greater than the number of women that have died at the hands of an international terrorist. If we want to pick another period, say over the past 20 years, 20 times as many women have died at the hands of domestic terrorists in the United States as at the hands of international terrorists. So, in order for us to be thinking realistically about women's safety, and I would argue about children's safety too, which I'll say more about, what our news media should be talking about is about domestic violence and violence against women about 5 times as much, or perhaps 20 times as much, as it's talking about the threat from international terrorism, in order to be realistically reflecting where the danger in the United States to women lies. And yet, of course, are we hearing about domestic violence 5 times as much or 20 times as much? No. We're hearing about nameless international terrorism 1,000 times as much. I didn't get that from a research study, I made that up. But it seems like it's easily 1,000 times as much as we're hearing about domestic violence from our televisions. And unfortunately, television is still what most people rely on for their view of what's going on in the world, which is a lot of why we're in the state that we're in. But the murders are also just the beginning of the lives that are being torn apart. And now statistics, studies of how prevalent domestic violence is vary. They come up with a lot of different findings. But one of the lower statistics that I've seen, and I spent a lot of time with the studies because of the writing that I do, gave us a rate of 16% in heterosexual relationships. That means a battering man or a battered woman are about 1 in 6. That's huge. That means millions and millions and millions of lives are being torn apart by fear, by violence, by being degraded and demeaned, by having basic freedoms taken away, and by then having to live, even after the violence or abuse stops, if it stops, with years and years afterwards of the after effects of trauma. And in the last 10 or 12 years, there has started to be a tremendous amount of research published about the impact on children of growing up witnessing their mom being battered by the children's dad or stepdad or by a live-in partner of the mom's. And we're finding that children are traumatized, sometimes for years after, by the violence that they're witnessing and by a whole set of other behaviors that they're subjected to at the hands of men who abuse women. We're finding that children have higher rates of involvement in violence if they've witnessed battering, of violence of all kinds, that they have higher rates of substance abuse, that they have higher rates of school performance problems, higher rates of school behavior problems, that when they get into teen years, they're more likely to perpetrate dating violence, they're more likely to be victims of dating violence, they're more likely to perpetrate sexual assault, they're more likely to be victims of sexual assault. They're more likely to run away from home. They're more likely to get involved in a gang. They're more likely to be school bullies. These is all in studies that are just piling up higher and higher and higher. I think that an argument can reasonably be made that domestic violence is our #1 social problem. And I'm not alone in that. One of the major public health associations about 2.5 years ago declared domestic violence this country's #1 public health problem. That's a striking conclusion, given the kinds of problems that this country has with drug and alcohol abuse, with HIV, AIDS, with heart disease, with cancer, including the epidemic of breast cancer, air quality, water quality. Nonetheless, the research that they did about what's costing us the most from a physical health standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, from expenses for lost work, law enforcement, and other kinds of public expenses that result from violence against women, domestic violence was named our #1 public health problem. The former Surgeon General Everett Koop declared that domestic violence was the #1 cause of injury to women in the United States. And some emergency room research studies have confirmed that women end up in the hospital with injuries from being battered more commonly than for any other cause of injury. And now, I continue to struggle, because of my professional connection to this issue, with how reluctant judges are to send batterers to jail or impose any other kind of meaningful consequence, how reluctant prosecutors often are even to prosecute. In a family law matter, how reluctant judges are to in any way restrict batterers' access to their children post-separation. In other words, a batterer essentially has the same opportunity to have unsupervised visitation or to win custody that a non-battering man has. We're not prepared yet as a society, and I don't mean we in this room, but the big we, in the society are not prepared yet to decide that violence against women is unacceptable, that it's destroying people's lives, that it's a violation of women's human rights, that it's a violation of the rights of the children who have to live in the atmosphere that this violence creates, and that it's simply not going to be tolerated anymore, that it has to stop. And I get asked, I'll come back to this question a little bit, but I get asked all the time, as someone who has specialized in counseling men who batter, and I don't do it the last couple of years because I'm on the road so much that I can't, but I was a counselor for men who batter for about 15 years. And I get asked all the time, well, can men who batter change? And I say, yes, I think the great majority can change, and the great majority don't. And they don't, not because they can't, but because they figured out that they don't really have to. And that once our society decides that battering is no longer going to be tolerated, battering will stop. I was just looking at studies in the last few months about jail, and I'm going to be saying some things about jail. I hate to be a promoter of jail. I'm actually someone who is against jail in all kinds of ways, and yet when it comes to batterers, I'm suddenly saying, yes, they should go to jail. But the studies on the effect of jail on men who batter, there are a number of interesting findings there, but the one that I'm going to mention right now is that it was found that jail was more effective at reducing reoffending, reducing recidivism among men who batter than among any other category of criminal. In other words, jail is particularly effective for stopping batterers. And I think I'm going to be able to explain tonight why that's true, what it is about men who batter that makes jail often work well to make them stop. I have seen a number of models across the country of communities who decided we're going to make domestic violence our top priority, or we're going to make it right close to our top priority. And we're going to coordinate efforts among a lot of different players in the community. We're going to bring in influential people. We're going to coordinate services. We're going to coordinate law enforcement response. Every time a woman gets killed, we're going to do an intensive study of what happened and what went wrong and what we could have done potentially to keep her alive, how we can keep the next woman alive, how we can stop the next batterer from killing. And I've seen communities make tremendous changes in what their community culture is about violence against women, in what their rates are of homicide, in what the sense is that a woman has that there will be a safety net out there for her, that she will be assisted, that she can find a way to get to safety. So if there's nothing else that you remember from tonight, I hope you will remember that we can do it. We can stop the domestic abuse of women. Next, I want to talk just a little bit about oppression, and I'm not going to say a lot about it because that I could give a 2-day speech just on the subject. But I now have, in many ways, some very different ways of thinking than I had 17, 18 years ago when I started into working with men who batter. And I came increasingly to perceive a home where there's a batterer as a little tyranny. I don't know what else to call it, but it's a little chunk of fascism or totalitarianism. And that in many ways, when we look closely at what's going on in a home where there's a batterer, in a relationship where there's a batterer, we find the key elements that are present in almost any oppressive system. That it's a microcosm, that if we learn well enough what's going on in a battering home, we can understand what's going on in a lot of other systems where people are being subjected to violence, or being exploited, or being demeaned, or being degraded, or being killed, or having their human rights denied. I'll say just a few things about it. That first of all, most forms of oppression that I know about involve violence, the threat of violence, and various kinds of intimidation, ways that you are reminded that violence could be done to you if you don't hyper-cooperate, if you make yourself too visible, if you fight back against the oppression in any way, or maybe for no reason at all, just to keep you guessing and off balance. Second, that in most cases where there's oppression, somebody's benefiting. There are people who are getting to live luxuriously, who are getting to do a lot less than their share of the work, who are getting to have a lot more than their share of the stuff, who are getting to make a lot more than their share of the decisions. And then there are other people who are being silenced, who are being shut up, who are not being permitted to talk, who are not being heard, or who are permitted to talk occasionally, but sort of on the terms. In other words, we'll listen when we feel like listening to you, and then we're going to silence you when we've had enough. That all systems of oppression involve, you can call it by different names, but propaganda, where the people involved and the society at large, the wider world, are told that the system is just, that it's right, that it's necessary, and that the people who are being subjected to this kind of treatment are less than, they are inferior, they're not human beings in the same sense that the rest of us are, that they don't suffer the way the rest of us suffer, they don't know pain the way the rest of us know pain, so we can't be as concerned for what they are going through. These elements are all present in the mentality of men who batter and the mentality of their allies, in their behavior, in how they get away with it, and in social systems that back them up and make it possible for them to get away with doing what they are doing. And this actually segues directly into the first thing that I want to tell you about men who batter, because it's very closely related, which is that battering is not at core a psychologically driven problem. It is at core a culturally driven problem. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Batterers are, psychologically speaking, in other words, from the point of view of their mental health, how their emotional worlds work, how they express themselves or don't express themselves emotionally, how much they suffer pain, how distorted their perceptions are not distinctly different from non-battering men on average. They are also not dramatically different from non-battering men in their skills. Researchers have measured their conflict resolution skills, their assertiveness skills, their communication skills, and they test about average, about the same as non-battering men. Ed Gondorf, who's one of the country's top researchers on men who batter, and he also does a lot of other very interesting domestic violence-related research, did extensive psychological testing using the MCMI, which for any of you who are in clinical fields at all is a modern, sophisticated psychological test that has a reputation for being good not only for catching major mental illnesses, but for catching what are known as personality disorders. And he still found that a solid majority of court-convicted battering men that he was testing tested normal, tested indistinguishable from a non-battering man. He did find among the minority that did have some mental health problems that they were more likely than non-battering men to have narcissistic personality disorders, meaning to be extremely self-centered, self-referential, see the world only through their own perspective, be incapable of taking the perspectives of others or caring about the perspective of others, and that they had higher rates of what's known as antisocial personality disorder, which is not, strictly speaking, really even a psychological problem. It's a moral problem. Antisocial personality disorder, which is also known as being a sociopath or being a psychopath, means that the individual lacks a conscience, that the individual just doesn't seem to have the normal mechanisms that the rest of us have for feeling bad about the pain that they've caused other people. But even when you allow for that increase in those categories compared to non-battering men, you still have a solid majority that don't have those problems or any other kind of noticeable psychological problem. When we look at their family of origin experiences, because the whole field of psychology tends to be very, very focused on what happened in people's families of origin, we do not find batterers having dramatically higher rates of having been abused as children than non-battering men. We do find them having higher rates than non-battering men of coming from homes where their mom was abused. In other words, it's really not child abuse that feeds woman abuse in the next generation, but woman abuse that feeds woman abuse in the next generation. Child abuse feeds child abuse in the next generation. But there's more even than that to say about what the research finds, because we tend to start, once we know about that, to think, oh, well, these boys who are so traumatized by growing up in homes where their mom is being battered, that's an emotional problem, that's a mental health issue. Well, two of the studies, there have been multiple studies that have looked at how domestic violence is transmitted to the next generation. But two of the studies specifically looked at the process of transmission for boys. In other words, what is it about growing up in a home where your mom is being battered that leads so many boys to grow up to become battering men? And one of the studies specifically compared boys that were more traumatized by the violence that they had witnessed to boys that were less traumatized by the violence that they had witnessed, both sets being from homes where there was a batterer, and found that they had about the same rates of growing up to become battering men. In other words, the level of trauma did not distinguish which boys became offenders and which boys didn't. And two of these studies looked to see what it was, and both found that it was the extent to which they had taken on the batterer's mentality that determined whether they followed in his footsteps or not, whether they had absorbed his key values and attitudes, such as had they come to believe that their mother was to blame for the violence that was done to her, because then that generalizes to believing that women are the cause of the violence that's done to them and that men are not responsible, or that somehow we can't be expected to do differently. I've had a lot of clients over the years who've talked about the violence that happened to us or the violence that happened to me as they're talking about their beating of women, as if somehow this violence was a spirit that possessed him and moved his arms and legs. And in other words, he's abdicating responsibility for the choices that he was making. And I'm going to talk a little bit about batterers and choice in a few minutes, but has the boy come to believe that you're not responsible for your own actions? Has he come to believe that females are inferior? Has he come to believe that females were put on this earth to make sure that men's needs are fulfilled, to be a sort of endless full-time servant? And what was it that years ago I remember hearing people say, when a man and a woman get married, they become one, and that one is the man. And this is very much the batterer value system. Another thing that I resonate with from years back is I remember when I was growing up, this has changed a little bit now, but when I was growing up, if you saw a man and a woman, a couple, in any kind of magazine ad, the man was always looking sort of deeply and thoughtfully into the distance, and the woman was looking at the man. And the message was, the man is deep, and the man thinks about the world, and the woman thinks about her man. And this is how the abuser wants the world to be, really carried to its extreme, where her life is supposed to always revolve around him and what he wants and needs. Now, when I say that battering is a culturally driven problem, I don't mean that it belongs to one particular culture. And for some reason, I don't get this question as much as I used to, but I used to, almost every time I spoke, somebody in the audience would say, and I still get it sometimes, somebody in the audience would raise their hand and say, well, aren't there cultures where domestic violence is just acceptable? And I have always answered, absolutely. Yours, for example. And I need to tell you about an experience that I had quite a few years back. I had already been working with batterers for a while. And I went with a friend to the Huntington Theater Company to watch Frankie and Johnny back when it was a stage show, before it became a movie. How many of you saw the movie? Fair number. Anybody see it on stage? Somebody else saw it on stage. A couple other people saw it on stage. I never saw the movie because after seeing the play, I'd had enough. The movie was called Frankie and Johnny Got Married. And I heard the movie was somewhat different, but not that much different. But in the play, the premise is that Frankie's a she, Johnny's a he. This is a play from quite a while back. Johnny knows that Frankie is the right woman for him, that they belong together, that they were made for each other, and that the only reason Frankie doesn't want to be with him is because she's afraid of intimacy and she's afraid of commitment. And so he comes over to her apartment one night to persuade her, in effect, that she doesn't know what's good for her, and that he adores her and he knows that she loves him and that they belong together. And for the next 2 hours of this play, he hassles her, at best. There's things that are worse than hassling, but he hassles her at best. Lots of criticism about what her faults are and why she doesn't want to be with him shows what's wrong. It just shows what's wrong with her. This escalates over the course of the play, where it's intensifying pressure, it's relentlessness, and then it starts to cross the line into abuse. And he starts to do things like not permit her to go to sleep. She's exhausted because he's been hounding her for hours, and she wants to go to sleep, and he says, no, you're not going to bed till we resolve this question. Resolve this question means till I get my way. And she goes and gets makes herself a sandwich. And he grabs the plate out of her hand and throws it into the sink. So he's not like, okay, so now in addition to sleep deprivation, she's being food deprived. She's not permitted to eat. This woman is being captive, in effect. She orders him out of her apartment. And he refuses to leave. She says, okay, I'm going to call the police. He says, go ahead, call the police. In an hour, they will have released me, and I'm going to be back on your fire escape. Sooner or later, you're going to deal with me. There are also, as I recall, at least a couple of incidents where he physically blocks her path and grabs her, I think it's particularly as she's trying to get into her bedroom to go to sleep. So there's also direct physical violence. Okay, physical violence, food deprivation, sleep deprivation, refusal to leave her apartment, refusal to honor her rights, a threat in effect, right? I'm going to be back on your fire escape, so he's threatening and intimidating her. No boundaries, complete invasion of her space, and tons and tons and tons of criticism, superiority. He knows better. She doesn't want to be with this man because she's afraid of commitment? No, she doesn't want to be with this man because he's a jerk. You should fear commitment with this man. You should fear intimacy with this man. What happens? Frankie sees the light. She has a huge breakthrough. I would too, so I could go to bed. She overcomes her fears of commitment. She overcomes her fears of intimacy. She realizes that Johnny is really the right man for her. They fall in love. The curtain closes. The play is over. I'm not on an airplane, so there is no air sickness bag available to me. Now, I'm not yet at the punchline to the story, however. Who goes to the Huntington Theater Company? Tickets were, I mean, this was a few years back, but tickets were already $35, $40. It's, who even likes theater, right? It's a very well-educated audience. It's an audience with money. This is a mainstream privileged, mainstream and above mainstream privileged American audience, overwhelmingly white, standing ovation. Including my friend, I'm sorry to say. I felt like kicking her in the shins. My quite aware friend, I might add. Standing ovation. I'm the only person in the Huntington Theater Company left in my seat. As far as I can tell, I was the only person that had any awareness of what we had just watched. That's why people can't tell me, well, what about those countries where domestic violence is just acceptable? It's like, in some countries, you have to put a nicer ribbon on it than others, that's all. In the United States, you got to pretty it up better than in some countries. That's the only difference. Well, that's not the only difference because we're actually making some cultural shifts, and the battered women's movement is having some successes. But it's a long process, and it's because of a movement, and it's because of activism, and it's because of very hard work. It's not because of some kind of cultural superiority. There have been quite a number of cross-cultural studies done. There's a lot of international work, not as much as I would like, but there's a lot of international work done studying domestic violence in different countries, comparing rates between different countries, and what do we find? We find that there's abuse of women, violence against women, domestic battery of women in all modernized societies. That there are very few societies in which anthropologists and other kinds of researchers have been able to find little or no violence against women, and there are societies that are structured in a completely different way from how modern societies are structured. They're far less hierarchical. There aren't clear centers of power in those societies. There are much less division of labor and power, particularly power, actually more than labor, between males and females. In other words, women have much higher status in those societies than they do in any modernized society. And there is not only no tolerance, socially speaking, for violence against women, but there's no tolerance for any form of violence. Violence is simply unacceptable behavior, period, in those cultures. So when I say that domestic violence, that the domestic abuse of women is culturally driven, I don't mean that it's driven by a particular culture. What I mean is that batterers learn battering and come to use those behaviors and believe in their right to use those behaviors through their socialization processes, through becoming part of their culture. So they learn them, yes, a lot of them learn them from dad or stepdad. A lot of them learn them at home. That's a lot of where you learn your culture's values is what's modeled in your family for you. Although fewer than half, by the way, researchers tell us somewhere between about 40 and maybe 45%, but below 50% of batterers come from homes where their mom was abused. So that's only one place to learn it, although it's a particularly powerful place to learn it. They learn it through all the ways that you learn about your culture. In other words, that would be a whole anthropological discussion, but they learn it through the religious values that they're taught. They learn it through the basic cultural values that they learn from their family, from their relatives, from television, from video games about what men are supposed to be like, what women are supposed to be like, who has the right to use violence, Who has the right to make rules? Who has the right to impose punishments? Who has the obligation to obey? And so forth. As a central part of my work as a counselor for men who batter, I have to deal with, as every batterer counselor has to deal with, how remarkably and disturbingly justified my clients feel in doing what they do. They will. Now, when a client first comes to a batterer program, he doesn't tend to start right out with his justification. Sometimes he does, but more often he comes the first week, the second week, the third week, saying he feels terrible about what he's done, that he knows it's rotten, that he knows it's not a way you should ever treat women. But as soon as he's really comfortable in the program and starts to get to know you and starts to get to know the other people in the program, without exception, I've never had a client this wasn't true of. Within a few weeks, he's starting to tell you why it's not fair to think that badly of him for what he did and why it's justifiable. And it's both excuses, in other words, why I'm not responsible for my actions, and justifications, which are why my actions were necessary. It's victim blaming. It's claims that this is just how men are and women can't expect men to be different. It's women that need to change. It's things like the client of mine who said, I kept trying to explain to the police that this was my wife, but they wouldn't listen. So I have to try to change a client's basic core values. I have to try to persuade him that things that he thinks are acceptable are completely unacceptable. And in that process, I end up learning where he got his values from often. Because in order to take up his side of the argument, he's going to tell me, well, but this is what my dad said, or this is what my grandfather said, or this is what I read in the Bible, or whatever his particular culture's spiritual texts, religious texts are. He's not quite as likely to openly say, well, I learned this from pornography, but when I press on the question, I very often find that pornography has been a critical influence in how he has decided what men are like and what women are like, what sex is like, and what violence is, whether violence is really so bad or not, and so forth. So having opened that can of worms up, I'm going to say a couple words about pornography. I know that we live in an era where there's a lot of kind of anti-sex campaigners out there, and I want to make it clear that I am not among them. Some of you may be. I'm not even saying anything about that. I'm just clarifying so you know where I stand. I'm not against sex. My beef with pornography has nothing to do with the fact that it's sexual or that it's sexually explicit or that there are naked bodies in it. My beef with pornography is, what kind of sexuality is it teaching? What is the version of sexuality that American pornography and pornography all over the world socializes our young men into? It's a version of pornography where, it's a version of sexuality, what I call the pornography school of sexuality, where sex is connected very often to violence, where violence is shown as being sexually exciting, where degradation is shown as being sexually exciting, where women are constantly robbed of all humanity, all compassion, all dignity. Of course, regular advertising does that too. You don't have to go to pornography. I mean, you constantly see women in your major newspapers in poses in their underwear that you would never see a man in such a pose. Because a man in such a pose, you'd say, he looks ridiculous. He's been robbed of all dignity. But for some reason, it's acceptable for women to be shown in these ways that rob them of all dignity. There's really nothing in pornography that's about love, that's about mutual respect, that's about kindness. Pornography also puts quite a bit of energy into saying that the more that a woman looks like a girl, the more she looks underage, the more sexually appealing that makes her. So it's specifically encouraging and socializing men to abuse, to abuse girls. They love to title their videos things like barely legal and things like that to really entice men into this attraction for underage females. When we try to address pornography in our communities, people start to scream censorship. That you're going to ruin people's First Amendment rights. You're bringing in censorship. I'm not an advocate of censorship. I'm not saying that the way to stop pornography is to censor it. I'm saying the way to stop pornography is to put enough pressure on carriers that they don't want to carry it because it's so unwelcome in their communities, and to put enough pressure on men and other consumers, because some women are heavy consumers of pornography also, to stop buying it and to stop giving this $10 billion a year industry our money because of the kind of damage that's being done to women in the production of pornography, in the use of pornography, and in what pornography is teaching our children. And by the way, lest you have any illusions about this, boys look at lots and lots and lots of pornography. I'm a former boy. And I can assure you that 30 years ago, pornography was very easy to get. Any boy who wanted to get his hands on it could get his hands on it. That was pre-internet. So if it was easy then, imagine how easy it is now. Very, very, whether we like it or not, it's a very heavy influence on how males in the society think about sexuality and how they think about females. If you were starting to talk about a magazine, a book, depictions in your community that were horribly racist, that glorified slavery, or that made torture of black people look exciting, and you said, we've got to get this out of our community, people wouldn't be screaming censorship at you. They'd be saying, we've got to get this out of our community. And we wouldn't propose to get that out of our community through censorship. We would propose to get that out of our community by decrying how racist it was, by blasting anyone who would sell it, by blasting anyone who would buy it. I'm saying the same thing about pornography. It has nothing, if anyone starts talking censorship, First Amendment, just tell them it's got nothing to do with it. We're talking about our right to protest and cry out and drive out of our communities without censorship through moral pressure, influences that are contributing so much to violence against females and to the attitudes that support it. And by the way, there's considerable research to show the ways that pornography actually affect, the ways that men's attitudes are actually different after they've spent time with pornography, that their belief systems change. Backpedaling now to talk some about how I came into this field to work with men who batter almost 20 years ago. And not understanding a lot, understanding certain pieces, but not understanding in any sense the fabric of what I've been talking to you about. In a sense, I've told you the end of the story first, in case anybody has to leave early. I came into this work with some understanding of the tragedy and outrage of violence against women in society, but on the micro level, I really, at the same time, didn't get it. And on the micro level, what I expected was that I was going to come in to work with these guys who were deeply ashamed of what they were doing, of beating women, that they sort of would do it because something came over them that they couldn't really control, but they then would feel terrible about after doing it, that they in many ways would hate their own lives, and that I was going to be offering them this other pathway that they knew nothing about, and they were going to be so excited to learn about this other pathway that was open to them, that was going to lead them into this beautiful garden, and all I had to do was open the door for them, and they were going to be kissing me on both cheeks for liberating them from this ugly life that they had been living. Now, I realize that young does not necessarily equal naive, but in my case, it did. And I really believed that my clients were going to be men who were inwardly tortured, that they suffered somehow differently from other men. So in my first couple of years as a counselor for men who batter, oh, by the way, one more thing I should say. I was told by my early mentors and trainers that this was rot, what I believed. But I thought, oh, that's just their political line. That's just their dogma. I didn't buy it. And I believe that they were ideologically very rigid, which actually they weren't. Not that there aren't some of those types running around some places, but actually in retrospect, the people that I worked with were not. But that's what I decided. And so then I had to struggle out for myself during my first 2 or 3 years working with men who batter, the fact that my experiences would keep not fitting with this whole set of beliefs that I had come in with. I kept running up against the remarkable consciousness that would go into my clients' actions. So I had one of my early clients, was one of my very first guys, a gas company employee who admitted that he'd beaten his wife up very, very badly, and that he had tied her to a chair, and he had torn some of her clothes off. Well, he said I had partly tied her to a chair. I mean, someone's either tied to a chair or they're not, right? How do you partly tie someone to a chair? Maybe he meant she could still move eyebrows or something, I don't know. But I say that because, again, it's an example of the whole way the battering mentality works. It's like you always minimize everything. You always split little hairs. You always make things sound, they say, like, I grabbed my wife by the throat and put her up against the wall like it was some sort of gentle delivery, He had beaten her, black and blue. It was horrible. And so I asked him what her injuries were. And he told me that she had these black and blues and welts all up and down her legs. And I said, did she have any injuries to her arms or to her face? And he looked at me. This guy was probably 15, 20 years older than I was. He looked at me like I must be some kind of idiot. And he said, I wasn't going to do anything that would show. Did I say he was very drunk at the time? He was very drunk at the time. And that wasn't just his claim, because I talked to his wife. I've always done interviews with the partners of my clients if I was able to get hold of them for numerous reasons, but mostly to try to find out what kind of danger she's in and what we can do to help her out. So even in this incredible rage that he was in, just furious and very drunk, he nonetheless continued to make quite aware decisions about where to hit her in ways that would hurt her terribly, but that wouldn't get him in trouble. And I caught on, but it took me a while. I remember a woman saying to me, oh, he just goes berserk and smashes things up all over the house. And I said, well, does he break your stuff, or does he break his stuff, or does he break stuff that belongs to the two of you? And there was this considerable pause on the other end of the line, and then she said, I never thought about that before, but it's only my stuff that gets broken. Now that speaks not only to the level of, I don't know if consciousness is the right decision, but of deliberateness, of chosenness that goes into batterers' behavior, but it also speaks to their remarkable ability to cause tremendous confusion, to create an electrified atmosphere of fear and intimidation that makes it very hard for even a really bright person to think clearly, so that in the midst of that chaos, a perfectly bright woman had never even noticed that it was only her stuff that got broken. And again, that speaks to how much we can offer women who are being abused, because women who are being abused are not different from other women. There have been so many research studies that have tried to figure out who are battered women. What are their issues? What kind of background do they come from? Why would they get involved with a man like this? And all the research can tell us is that they are women. With one exception, that there is some solid research evidence that they have a somewhat higher rate, not a vastly higher rate, a somewhat higher rate of coming from homes where their mom was battered. But even that, when you look carefully at the research, it turns out does not indicate that they're more likely to get involved with a batterer. What that indicates is that they're more likely to stay longer than another woman if they do get involved with a batterer, because of what they learned. They learned it's your own fault. They learned you got to work harder to please the man. They learned there's no way out. They learned that police come and don't do anything, and various pieces of information, of unfortunate information, that they absorbed from their experience. Battered women are just women. That means that most of what we see going on for a battered woman is a product of her circumstances. I'm not saying that in other words, she's neither better nor worse than anybody else. She's another human being. And yeah, she's going to come in with some issues, but any of us would come in with some issues. So ultimately, that doesn't tell us very much, does it? And I mean, there are also cases where she's coming in with severe issues that are making it harder for us to help her. But that's not the norm. The norm is for her to be pretty much like anybody else. And a sort of quick way of thinking about this that I think is helpful and that I'll offer you in hopes that this is another piece that might stay with you from tonight. When we look at how a particular woman is reacting to being abused, and we're trying to understand why she reacts in certain ways or is doing certain things or is making certain choices or is feeling certain ways, we tend to try to find the answer to those questions by looking more and more closely at her, putting her more and more tightly under the microscope. And I would argue the answers lie much more in putting him more and more under the microscope. The more you look at him, the more you understand his behaviors, the more you understand how he messes with minds, the more you understand his manipulative tactics. And it's different. Each abuser is a little different from the others. They have their particular tricks. They have their particular abilities. They have their things that they're better at than others. The more you get what it would be like to live with him, the more her reactions start to not seem so mysterious and start to seem more or less like how anyone would react in her circumstances. A couple of great resources I can point you towards. One is Dr. Judith Herman, psychiatrist at Cambridge. She was at Cambridge Hospital last I knew. Wrote what I really consider the Bible on trauma, or at least it was in its time, called Trauma and Recovery. And one thing that Dr. Herman did that I thought was particularly interesting, it's practically every sentence of the book is profound, but is that she compared women and men who had been in circumstances of captivity and found that their reactions were not very different. In other words, she compared women who had lived in circumstances where they were being battered to men who had been in prisoner of war camps or in hostage-taking situations and found that the symptoms, the reactions, the confusions, the desire to protect the abuser, and on and on and on, were actually very, very similar between the two groups. That again, women's reactions to oppression don't have much to do with being women and have almost everything to do with being oppressed. And these conditions are going to be pretty similar for anyone who's in those circumstances. And that means that we have a lot to offer, because it means that we can help a woman a lot by offering support, by offering clarity, by offering some insight into what the abuser mentality is like and what he's getting away with, by offering resources, a safe place to stay, a shoulder to cry on, some help with child care, a support group. The kinds of work that the Women's Network does is so crucial to our communities. And here I am tonight primarily to talk about the horrors and dynamics of battering, but I want to also tell you that everywhere I go, I also hear women's stories about how they got out, about the fact that they're not living that way anymore, about what the Battered Women's Program did for them. I hear that particular one over and over and over again. So many women have come up to me and saying, you know, if it weren't for these women that put this conference on today, because most of the places I go, I'm invited by the Women's Program, if it weren't for these people who are here today, I probably wouldn't be alive today, or I'd still be with my abuser, or I'd still be feeling like it was all my fault. And these people were my lifeline. And it's really touching and inspiring to hear these stories, and it's as important to hear those stories as it is to look at the women who are still trapped, to look at the abusers who are still getting away with it. It's really critical. All right, so that little tangent aside. So I started to have to accept the fact that my clients were pretty aware of what they were doing. A great moment, and I worked for Emerge in Cambridge. I wasn't one of the founders, but I got there a few years after it started, but I was at Emerge for many years, which was the first program, specialized program for men who batter in the country. A great moment while I worked there, but it didn't involve me. David Adams and Carol Souza, who both worked there, they led a batterer group together. And Carol Souza was really one of my biggest influences. David Adams also huge in what I've learned from him. And from Susan K. Wett and various others, Ted German and various others that Emerge. David and Carol had prepared a skit for a training that they were going to be doing on domestic violence, where David was playing the batterer and Carol was playing the battered woman. And they decided that they would rehearse it in front of their group that they led for men who batter. They were curious to see how their clients would react to this and whether the clients would feel it was realistic or not. And so they acted it out for their group. And the group's reaction was very interesting. The group's reaction was to get quite energized and agitated by this skit and be very bothered by things that David was doing wrong and start telling him how he should be doing it. And they were telling him things like, well, you can't let her talk like that because once she gets going, you'll never shut her up. You got to cut her off right away as soon as she starts. And they would say, you got to move closer to her so that she knows that you mean business. Move over more where she is. And in other words, in the excitement of giving feedback on this skit, they were forgetting to play their normal role of out of control, I don't know why I do it, I don't know what comes over me, abuser. So as I started to put these pieces together and finally started to believe the people around me and what they'd been telling me for a while, my mentors at Emerge, I started to ask my clients why they had not done even more serious things. Okay, you're telling me that you lost control of yourself, because they always say they lost control of themselves. You say that you slapped her twice and then you shoved her and she fell onto the floor. Okay, there she was on the floor, right? It would have been easy to kick her in the head. Why didn't you kick her in the head? He can always tell me why. He doesn't say, the way someone who was truly out of control would say, gee, I don't know, I just stopped or I just didn't. He'll say, oh, I didn't want to hurt her that badly. If I did that, I could kill her. I suddenly realized one of our children was watching. These were all sort of real life things the clients have told me. She was screaming really loud, and the neighbors have called the police on us before. It's never on me, it's on us. The neighbors have called the police on us before, and I was afraid they'd call again. And the most common response I get, more common than all the others put together, when I lay out those scenarios of why you didn't do even the next thing up the line, oh, I wouldn't do that. And that's a very revealing response, because it tells you, A, that he's not out of control, that he doesn't do things that to his own moral system are beyond the pale, and it tells you that his fundamental problem is in his beliefs about what is acceptable, because he believes as long as he doesn't cross that line, it's okay. If he's the kind of guy who tells his wife periodically that he's going to kill her, and he locks her in rooms, and he raises his fist to her, but he never actually punches or slaps her, then the real batterer is the one that punches or slaps her. If he's the one that punches or slaps her, then the real batterer is the one that strangles her. If he strangles her, then the real batterer in his mind is the one that puts a gun to her throat, to her head, and says he's going to kill her, and who rapes her. And then if he does those things, then the real batterer is the one who killed her. It's always this other. Oh, one more I got to tell you. Dozens and dozens of clients have said to me, you know, I'm not one of those guys who comes home and beats his wife for no reason. Again, very revealing of the batterer mentality. The real batterer is the guy that does it for no reason. Well, I've never known the guy that does it for no reason. He doesn't exist. Every batterer develops this system for justifying what he does. What's in it for him? Why batter? First of all, he gets his way. And I don't want you to get the impression that battered women don't stand up for themselves. This is one of the complete misconceptions about battered women. They do stand up for themselves. But it gets harder and harder as the years go by. And they start picking their battles more and more. They stand up for themselves less often. They stand up for themselves less forcefully, except for periodic times when they just decide to let out all stops, but they pay a huge price every time they go for it, standing up for themselves or standing up for their children. And so he gets more and more cooperation and compliance over time because he's dangerous. He's at the very least severely psychologically dangerous, and he's at least to some extent physically dangerous. I should say, by the way, that over 50%, not 80%, not 90%, but over a little better than half of battered women do some kind of, I don't know what image you think of as beating up, but do some kind of physical or sexual assault on her every month. There are other batterers who, they let it boil, they make you feel like maybe it's going to come, you never quite know when it's going to come, but the actual physical or sexual assault happens every 2 years. And that can be enough to keep everybody in the family, as long as it comes out once in a while, or he knows how to get you to feel like it's just about to come, that's enough to keep everybody in the family really frightened and walking on eggshells. So he gets a lot of cooperation, he gets his way. He gets economic benefits. He gets to orient the family's resources towards what matters to him. He's often ripping the woman off economically in all kinds of ways, taking money from her, getting her inheritance from her, running her into debts, borrowing money from her that he never pays back, and so on and so forth, destroying her earning ability often in various ways, in other words, sabotaging the development of her education or her career. At divorce time, the effects of this often become particularly pronounced because the whole way that he's laid the groundwork can leave her in a situation where he's got everything and she's got nothing. And this happens particularly commonly in a domestic violence divorce. So there's economic benefits to him. He gets a lot of service on his terms, get waited on, get his meals cooked for him, get the shopping done for him, his children raised for him, all this work. And he can give back as much or as little as he chooses. It's entirely on his terms. And he's going to tend to get her working very, very hard. Women and children in homes where there's a batterer work extra hard, generally, to please the batterer. You have to. You have to. If you don't, you will pay for it. So he gets catering. He gets to impose a lot of double standards. So he can be very flirtatious with other women or even be sleeping with other women, but punish her terribly for even having a male friend. He, over time, tends to start punishing her terribly even for having female friends. He tends to isolate her socially increasingly over time. He gets to criticize her relentlessly, but he gets to be above criticism himself. Very hard. You can criticize the batterer to some extent some days, but he's never going to do anything about it, even the days that he does let you do it. Other days he's going to cream you for trying to criticize him. I noticed how my clients seemed constantly to be talking about how their wives or girlfriends nag them. Oh, she nags me this, she nags me about this, she nags me about that. And I figured out, it took me a while, it took me a long time actually, but I finally figured out what this means. Nag means presses me to meet my responsibilities. Because his attitude is, he should never be called on what he hasn't done, or on what he has done, the bad things he has done, or the things he should have done that he hasn't. He's not supposed to hear about those things. You're not to raise grievances with him. So he gets to be above criticism. He gets to control the sexual life of the relationship so that the sex can be on his terms. Or if he's not interested in sex, and some batterers aren't, he can be in a relationship and not have any responsibility to the sexual life of the relationship at all, if that's what he chooses. It's just all however he wants to do it. If he wants to have lots of outside affairs, as a lot of batterers do, not all batterers do, but a lot do, he gets to do that. I know I go off into a lot of these stories, but these experiences were just so important to how I came to understand these things. A client of mine was telling me that he had assaulted his wife It hit her because she was accusing him of having an affair. Now, I asked him a question that nobody except a batterer counselor would ever think to ask this man, which is, well, were you? And he said, yes, but she had no proof. And she shouldn't be saying things like that when she has no proof. So you can even be correctly accusing a batterer of having an affair and get hit for that. And of course, in real terms, you're at more risk, actually, with a batterer if you're accusing him of something he really is doing than if you're accusing him of something that he isn't. This is something we really see, I think, in the modern-day fathers' rights movement, where they say they're so concerned with false allegations of domestic violence or false allegations of child sexual abuse, but when you look carefully at their stands on a lot of different issues, it becomes clear that it's not the false allegations that concern them. It's the true allegations that concern them. That's what they're upset about, and it comes out in I won't really have time to talk about that tonight, but I've spent a lot of time reading their literature, reading their websites, reading their responses to things I've written and so forth, and it becomes really clear that, well, for example, I'll just give you one example. I promise I won't go off on a soapbox about this, but they say they're very concerned about false allegations, yet they argue against more thorough investigation of allegations of abuse. Well, if you were concerned about false allegations, you would want them to be more thoroughly investigated, not less thoroughly investigated. Batterers reap this tremendous set of rewards from battering. I think this is the best kept secret, probably, about domestic violence, is that it's actually working pretty well for the typical batterer. For some batterers, it's not. For some batterer, he's in some ways messing up his life, almost, not as much, but almost as much as he's messing up her life and his children's life. But that's not actually the norm. That's the way a batterer is portrayed a lot of times in movies, as this character where you almost feel as sorry for him as you do for her. That's not the typical batterer. The typical batterer is someone for whom the system is actually going pretty well. You don't see batterers hit bottom the way a substance abuser does. A batterer can batter for 20 years, can batter for 30 years, and still be in pretty good health, still have a lot of friends if he's the social style of guy, still be very popular in his community. His life, his career may have gone perfectly well, or his job life may have gone perfectly well during that time. It can work out just fine sometimes for him. And this is why the battering of women has gone on for thousands, well, as well as we know, at least a few thousand years, is because, unfortunately, so many men perceive that it works. And it wasn't in any way illegal until very, very recent times. There weren't enforceable, in any way meaningful enforceable laws against the domestic abuse of women in Massachusetts until 1992. Women did start to get access to restraining orders in the late 70s, and that did start to make a difference in women's freedom in some cases. It was a meaningful step. I'm not saying it wasn't. But from the point of view of there being any significant chance that a batterer would experience any consequences for his actions, 1992. And even now, in 2006, he's very unlikely to get more than a very light slap on the wrist, even if he's convicted of a quite significant assault. When we start to understand how much batterers are benefiting from battering, we become much less inclined to feel sorry for them and much more inclined to hold them accountable for their actions, impose meaningful, unpleasant consequences, be there 100% for their victims, be there 100% for the children who are being exposed to this kind of treatment of their mother. And so I think it's very important to get the word out. I have a lot of experience, as anyone here who works with batterers certainly will also have, of clients who look like they're starting to change and then they backslide. And when you ask them, why did you go back to your old ways of behaving? It almost always comes out that it's some way that his privileges were slipping. It's some way that the benefits that he counts on, I mean, he doesn't think of it that way. I'm not saying that it's formulated that way in his mind. But when he starts to talk about what was starting to arise that led him to go back to the battering, it was some luxury or unfairness or injustice that he was used to being able to impose that he was now not being able to impose as well as he had before, so he went back to his old ways. I've said a number of things about the impact on children of living around a batterer, and I'm going to be saying a lot about this in the presentation tomorrow morning. But just a few points I want to make about it tonight. First of all, when you think about the mentality of a batterer that I've talked to you about, let's do a quick recap here. He's extremely controlling, and he believes in his right to be in control and to dominate. He periodically uses violence, and he believes in his right to use violence when he deems it necessary. He expects that the life of the relationship should revolve around the meeting of his needs. In other words, he has a very selfish, self-centered orientation towards partner relationship. He may not have that orientation towards other aspects of his life. That varies from batterer to batterer. But you're my woman. This is about what you should do for me. Of course, during the dating phase, it's all about what I'm going to do for you and what we're going to do for each other, and we're going to make beautiful music together and so forth. But the battered woman was just telling me this very powerful story. She was a playwright, and actually she did all kinds of writing. And while she was in the early stages of the relationship with the man really trying to charm her, he was talking to her about how excited he was by her writing, and how where they lived was just a great place for a writer, and how because he made quite a bit of money, he was head of an ashram. She wouldn't need to bring in very much money, and as soon as they moved in together and their relationship got serious and committed, and in fact they got married, it was like almost overnight. You know, we don't have time for you to be writing, that this is a waste of time, you're really pretentious, what makes you think this is something you could do anyhow, and you've got to be bringing in money, and, you know, I don't know. It was just like, it had flipped over to the other side. So, a guy who, you know, once he's in a serious relationship, it's all about what's for him, and what's good for him, and what he needs. Well, a couple things I didn't mention about him, that he tends to be a real objectifier. In other words, he tends to really see a woman as a thing. Not necessarily all women, although some of them just have big problems respecting or interacting with women in general, but a woman, specifically a woman that he's involved with, he really sees as almost like a personal possession, you know, like a trophy that you would take home and put on the mantle. And so that her feelings, her needs, her ambitions, her humanity just tends to slip out, become less and less important to him over time. And she's like an owned object. All right, when you think about this profile, that's not a recipe for good parenting. I realize that's an understatement. To be a good parent, you have to do everything the opposite, right? You have to be able to go without a lot of your needs being met for years. And you get what you can, because you can't live on nothing. But responsible parents find that their own needs get laid aside to a tremendous extent for a long time, particularly while children are young. You have to let it go. You have to be able to, in other words, extensively focus on somebody else's needs and understand those needs. You have to have a lot of respect. You have to be able to cooperate with the other parent if you're in a two-parent situation, and respect that person's parenting judgment and be able to negotiate with and struggle with, in a respectful way, things that the other parent wants to do as a parent that you don't agree with or don't think are good. You absolutely have to not use violence. And there may be people in the room who disagree with me about that, but I think it's overwhelmingly clear that any hitting of children is destructive to them, and that spanking children is hitting them. Let me say one thing about spanking, which is that I was almost never spanked as a child. I was spanked only a handful of times. And when I remember what it was like, when I really remember what it was like really a few times when I've sat and really thought about it, and really, because there's one incident in particular that I can really remember, I feel so furious and so bitter that I feel like I could kill somebody. And I feel so completely betrayed and alone in the world that the people who were supposed to look after me and keep me safe could be hitting me. And here's what I think happened in my childhood. I think that I didn't get hit enough. And what I mean by this is, if you get hit enough times, it just all gets buried in how painful it all is, and you can't remember anymore how awful it was. And that's why so many people are running around saying, well, I hit my children and I turned out, I got hit a lot when I was a kid and I turned out okay. Although my battering clients love to use that argument, and I say, excuse me? You're not really the person to be making that argument, are you? But there are a lot of other people who say, and I think it's because when something happens to you enough times, it becomes so traumatic and so painful that it just gets buried away, and you can't remember anymore. And I think what happened is because I only got hit a few times, I'm able to remember what it was really like, and it was horrible, horrible, horrible. Please don't ever, ever hit your children for any reason. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It may get you the cooperation in the short term that you want, and in the long term it will greatly interfere with whatever your goals may be for that child, and more importantly, will really interfere with that child's potential to have a happy life. So I can also tell you what the research, I won't go into it, but the research is quite profound about the impact on children being hit also. So essentially everything that you need to do in order to be a good parent are things that batterers tend to be quite weak on. And batterers also have much, much higher rates than other men of abusing children. 7 times the rate of non-battering men of physically abusing children. 6 times the rate of non-battering men of sexually abusing children. They're much more likely than non-battering men to perpetrate incest. And again, when you look at the literature on incest perpetration, it's very similar mentality. You read Judith Herman, read Nicholas Groth, read Eric Lieberg, read Anna Salter. It's a power and control issue. It's not a sexual issue. And the incest perpetrator is very manipulative, very self-centered. A couple of the writers, including one of the research studies, specifically found that incest perpetrators feel justified in doing what they're doing. And one of the studies, actually two of the top writers, Nicholas Groth and these other folks whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, Fantuzzo and these others, found that incest perpetrators have this concept of entitlement, that they're entitled to sexual use of their children. So it's in other words, at core, what they share is exploitativeness and a sense of ownership. Those two pieces are why there's such a high overlap between battering and incest perpetration. I'll be talking more about those issues tomorrow as well. Now, there are batterers who are reasonably responsible parents. I don't mean to suggest that all batterers are disastrous parents, although it's not good parenting to batter your children's mother. That's one of the worst. That in itself shows reckless disregard for your children's well-being. So anytime a client of mine says he's a good father, I have always said, well, no. I'm sure you do some good things as a father, but I'm not willing to give you the mantle good father when you abuse these children's mother. That's terrible for your children. You really care about your children deeply, you'll never do that again. But given that limitation of how good a parent you can, there's only so good a parent you can be while you're abusing the children's mother, given that limitation, batterers are really on a spectrum in how they treat children, from some that are more or less okay to some that are just terribly psychologically destructive to children or who beat them or sexually abuse them. My main concern continues to be about their psychological destructiveness to children even more than the other kinds of harm that they may do. So it's very, very important for us in our communities to influence family courts to stop being so liberal in granting access to children post-separation to their battering dads. That kind of access has to be greatly curtailed. It has to be much better evaluated before it's granted. And mothers have to be much more supported for protecting their children. A mother's trying to protect her children is being a good parent. That's what parents are supposed to do. That's what we should be rewarding parents who are trying to protect their children. And instead, protective parents, particularly protective moms, just get slammed into little bits. in family court proceedings for custody and visitation, and they get treated like there's some horrible vermin for the fact that they're trying to protect these children. So I want to stop in just a few minutes. So I'm going to make a couple of closing comments. First of all, there's a lot of research on interventions with men who batter. What's the impact of arrest? What's the impact of prosecution? What's the impact of a batterer intervention program? What's the impact of a tightly supervised versus an unsupervised probation? And different research studies find different things, but the overall picture suggests that these interventions make some difference, that they will reduce the rate of reoffending on average among men who batter. However, and studies have looked at short jail sentences, sort of the 30 to 60 day range, and long jail sentences on the order of 9 months. Of all these interventions, the only one that has been found to take a really large bite out of recidivism, to be, in other words, a really significant deterrent to reoffending for a large percentage of the population, is the 9-month jail sentence, the long jail sentence. I've had to change my tune about this because I used to be really against long jail sentences. I'm against jail in general because they're incredibly inhumane environments. You can't somehow help people become productive, non-offending members of society by being cruel to them, insulting them, it's giving them no rights and so forth. And there's tremendous discrimination by race and class in who ends up in jail. In other words, the privileged can escape it in a lot of different ways. So I don't think the jail is in any sense the long-term solution. But unfortunately, for now, it's the best we've got. It's the only thing that's being proven to be really effective in deterring men who batter. And I would argue that it's, for all the reasons I've already said, that the privileges that batterers get from battering are too much. They're too good. And only a really significant chunk of time in jail is enough to make him decide that he's willing to give up a lifetime that he's spent getting ready to use women for his own purposes. Two other things I want to say. One, I have seen a dramatic and very encouraging change in the 15 years that I've been speaking publicly on domestic violence in where men stand on this issue. For the first several years that I was speaking, men in my audience tended to be defensive. They tended to say that I was attacking men, that I was saying bad things about men in general, even though I'm really careful not to do that. Somehow that's still what they would hear. And would feel like they had to defend themselves, would feel like they had to defend men in general, would go on the counterattack against women. I almost never get that anymore. The change is incredible. And actually what I do get is men who are much more vocal than they would have been 15 years ago in a positive way, who are saying, well, how can I help with this? How can I help with this? Who are giving examples of ways that they have spoken out in their communities or ways that they have challenged other men about what they're doing. And there's a huge and encouraging change out there that so many more men now want to get on the right side of this question, are not seeing it as men versus women, but are seeing it as abusers against everybody else, which is how it should be perceived from the point of view of what kind of damage it's doing to all of our lives, but certainly to the lives of women that we care about. And I just want to say, let's keep it going that direction. Let's encourage men to find more ways to speak out, to be visible as a man against violence against women in your community, to look for where you can sign a letter to the editor where it'll be important that a man wrote that letter, to where you can be talking to a group where it'll be important that a man was the one talking to that group, to who you can challenge in your personal professional life about their own behaviors or attitudes, because it's really, really powerful. Of course, we need to be continuing always to support women's activism and women's leadership, but at the same time, making our own voices heard loudly has a tremendous impact, and men are often particularly affected when they're called by other men on what they're doing. And let me just say finally that I don't think that we can separate out domestic violence and violence against women from all questions of ways that women are oppressed as a group in society. And then we can't separate out the oppression of women from all forms of oppression of people by class, by race, by sexual orientation, and on and on and on. And that yes, it makes sense to continue to devote certain kinds of particular focus to stopping violence against women. That's certainly what I choose to do in my life. But we've got to always be making the links to how we're going to form a society where people are not degraded because of being part of any group, or not exploited or assaulted or jailed because of being part of any group, and where the resources of our society are properly shared amongst all the resources, and the power are properly shared amongst all the people who live here. This country is, people frequently refer to this country as a democracy. I don't get that, but you'll have to help me understand. But even though we have a very, very small and powerful group of people that make almost all the decisions that govern our lives, and even though we have one of the most horrible distributions of wealth between rich and poor in the world, I think when we're talking about stopping battering, we're talking about declaring that homes have to be democratic places. That homes have to be places where everybody has an equal say. Well, children don't have quite an equal say, although they should have some significant say. I wouldn't say they should have an equal say, but they should have better say than they tend to have. Some houses they have a little too much say, but that among all adults, there should be equal say in a household and equal access to resources, and that's linked to demanding a society that stops paying this laughable lip service that would pay to democracy in this country, and start demanding a society where people truly do share the decision making and share the wealth. Thank you very much, and we have the rest of the time for questions. The question was, if I were speaking to a group of young women, what would I say about what to watch out for, warning red flags? By the way, I really focused tonight, because it's my area of expertise, on men who abuse women, but there are gay men that abuse their gay male partners, there are lesbians who abuse their female partners, and there are sometimes very serious cases, there are sometimes homicides. In other words, it's not a situation we can take lightly. So one of the things that what's calling this to my mind is, one of the things that I'd have to say to young women is, the fact that you go out with women doesn't somehow make you safe is not going to make you safe from abuse. You're still going to have to watch out for the same kinds of things. They'll take somewhat different form in women, and obviously women aren't socialized in the same way, but it'll come out in different ways. Really watch out, perhaps top of the list, for jealousy and possessiveness, which to young women in particular tends to be really flattering. You know, oh, I've never had a guy care about me like that before. Oh, he's just crazy about me. He gets so upset if I even talk to another guy. Like that feels like love, but it ain't. It's ownership. And it's one of the top warning signs for domestic violence. Just watch out about a guy who's controlling. Again, that can be exciting at first. You hear him described as a take charge kind of guy. But you have to say, but what happens when you don't want to do what he wants to do? What happens when you don't want him completely in charge? That's what she has to really pay attention to. How does he react when she doesn't want to go along? Because if he has really bad reactions to that, that's a really bad sign. To watch out for a guy who's got problems with women in general. For example, the kind of guy who says that all his previous girlfriends were you-know-whats, but you're different. Or who says, and this, by the way, all moms and dads, these are all things we should be talking to our daughters about. Or who says, you're the first girl or you're the first woman who's ever understood me. If you're the first female who's ever understood him, I want to know why. Why is he so hard to understand? And the other thing that I say is, if a guy is telling you now that you're different from all other women, what he's going to be telling you in a year or two is that you're just like the rest. You're going to go from being the exception to being part of the rule. So watch out for how he talks about women in general, including you might listen to some things about how he talks about his own mother, but particularly past girlfriends, past wives or girlfriends. To really, really notice how he deals with challenge. This is often the litmus test, is what happens when he is stood up to. Then, do you feel respected by him? Because sometimes women tell me that they feel terribly loved by the man, but when I say, yeah, but do you feel respected? Huh. And it's odd that we can even separate love and respect, but we do. Like, is he actually interested in your opinions? Does he actually care what you think about things? Or does he think your opinions are just something to be altered, to fit his? I remember this old Malvina Reynolds song where she says, he thinks my head's all full of nothing, he can't wait to put his special stuff in. And then, are things never his fault? Or he gives these apologies, but they're not very sincere sounding apologies, and then he demands that that be adequate. He says, well, I said I was sorry. First of all, an apology that sounds like that is never going to be very satisfying, but an apology also isn't necessarily enough. Often when someone apologizes, you also want to tell them some things about how they affected you. Say, well, that's great that you apologized, but I'm also going to tell you some things about the mess that you made or the harm that you did. He's going to say, no, he doesn't want to hear that. He apologized, that should be enough. Those are really the critical pieces to watch for. Another additional one that's sometimes revealing is to notice whether he treats you differently alone than when other people are around. This actually tends to do a flip between teen years and adulthood. Teen years, he often treats her worse when other people are around and better in private. And then in adulthood, the abuser starts to flip and be worse with her when there's nobody watching and better when there's other people around. With teens, I really emphasize, is he pressuring you to have sex? And because he's telling her, if you really loved me, we'd be having sex, or we've been going out for 2 months and we're not doing it yet, or whatever it is. And that's so clearly not respect, that's so clearly not love. And what I say to teens is, if somebody really loved you, would he want you to be having sex before you felt comfortable or ready for that, or before it was what you really wanted? Is that love? And that's a good in to get that conversation going. The question was giving an example of the kind of thing some abusers will say, where she says, you know, I'm not going to take this from you, or I'm leaving you, or whatever it may be. You're not going to treat me like this. And he says, you mess with me, I will destroy you. And mess with me means don't do what you're told, or try to leave me, or it can mean a number of things. Why would he want to destroy her? Well, most abusers don't want to destroy her. It's a threat to get her to cooperate. He would rather destroy her, however, than have her be an independent human being that would not follow his lead or would not be with him, because he deeply believes that that's a female's obligation, that that's your job if you're involved with him, that you must do that. And I've had client after client say to me, she had no right to leave me. It's like, why? I thought in this society we accepted people's rights to leave relationships that they didn't want to be in anymore, especially if they're being abused. But there's generally commonly accepted in the society that there's some pockets where that's not believed, but in general in the society nowadays, we believe that you don't have to be in a relationship anymore when you don't want to be. But he'll insist, no, she owes it to me. But there's the level of hatred that you're describing can be really disturbing. And the depth of his sense that a woman is obligated to do these things for him. And a fair number of batterers, and I don't have a percentage because it hasn't been researched, but I've observed with my clients, a fair number of batterers really have big problems with females in general, and sometimes a level of hatred towards females in general. And it's ugly and scary and violent. And they sometimes can cover it up pretty well in the early days, unfortunately. There is not a psychological test that exists that will distinguish a battering man from a non-battering man. There's not a psychological test that exists, by the way, that will distinguish an incest perpetrator from a non-incest perpetrator, or in fact any kind of child sexual abuser from a non-child sexual abuser. Battering is, as I said at the beginning, not a psychological problem. It's a problem of learned behavior, of values and attitudes, and therefore a psychological test cannot detect it. I was just on Tuesday training a whole bunch of judges in New Jersey, although training with judges is a strong word. I was speaking in the general direction of some judges that were seated in the room. And what I had to, these are judges that do custody visitation, who do family law proceedings, and what I had to say to them is, psychological testing in a domestic violence case is a mistake. It's actually not going to tell you anything relevant about whether the allegations are true or false, or if they are true, because they're almost always true, are they real serious or less serious? How risky is this particular man for the child? There's no psychological test that's designed to do that. What the court should be doing, instead of psychologically testing the parties, is investigating the evidence. And they should be appointing a good investigator instead of a clinical evaluator. The clinical evaluator is helpful to you when you've got someone with serious mental health problems who can help you figure out whether this person is capable of parenting their children and what kind of help they need in the meantime. But that's not what mental health evaluation is typically used for in custody. It's typically used to say, is someone an abuser or not, or who should have custody? It's completely inappropriate to use psychological testing to say who should have custody. And yet it's used for that purpose all the time. It's a huge topic, and I'll say some things about it tomorrow, and I could talk about it for a long, long time, but I'll just point to a few things. That first of all, maintaining the closest possible relationship with him that you can. And that means, of course, obviously, working all the time extra hard on your parenting. Unfortunately, an abused woman in many ways has to be a better parent than other parents. I'm not saying it's fair, I'm not saying it's right, it's just real, it's the way it is. You have to read extra books, you have to get extra help, you have to work on yourself more, you have to work on working out your conflicts with your child, because the abuser will look for any crack that he can exploit to drive you apart. So you want to make your relationship an extra high priority and really work on it well. Read some of the great parenting books and things like that. All of us have more to learn. I mean, all of us have more to learn. Everybody can always be working on. Every parent should be reading parenting books and trying new things and going to workshops. I mean, we all have more to learn about being better parents. I've been a parent for 14 years now, and I still learn new things practically every day, including some things I wish I'd learned a long time ago. Next, here's a trick, but what you want to do, you want to try to avoid burdening your child with too much awareness about the heavinesses and difficulties of the world, and yet he needs to start learning right away about sexism. Because if he's taught, and 3.5 is old enough, actually, to start learning about concepts of equality between males and females, to start learning about respect for women and girls, to start pointing out to him when other people aren't being respectful to a female, or when advertising or television is not being respectful to females. Also start pointing out to him unhealthy images of masculinity. In other words, when there are being bad messages sent to him about what a man should be like. In other words, the earlier that he can learn to start thinking critically about gender messages, the harder it's going to be for his dad to recruit him to his team. Another thing is that abusers are very, very strong at sort of brainwashing, manipulation, getting you to think like you think, like he thinks. So if the mom tries to get the children to think like she thinks, and the abuser's trying to get the children to think like he thinks, he's going to win. Because you're playing right to his strengths. That's his area. So you have to teach your children to think for themselves. That's the only way so you're actually stepping outside of his game, getting the child to think like you. And children who are taught to think for themselves can learn gradually over time to see through their dad's thinking. The last point that I'll make now is that when moms try to talk to their children about the abuser's issues, it tends to backfire, because children start to feel defensive of him and protective of him, and they don't want to hear bad things about him. On the other hand, to let things go by is a real problem also. Oh, dad said such and such, and it's really unhealthy stuff. Or dad says that you're telling the court that he hit you and he never hit you. That's a total lie. These are all things that really happen in these cases. And so a couple things that you can do. One is to try to teach children to identify their father's behavior in other people without saying that that's something dad does. So when you see, for example, a parent at a playground doing some of the same kinds of things that you know the dad does, point that out to the child. Don't connect it to dad. Don't say your dad does that too. Just say, did you see what happened? Here's what's not okay about that. What do you think about that? How do you think that made the child feel? Or what do you think that person's doing? Or just explain it yourself if the child can't get it. So that they learn to analyze adult behavior, and particularly learn to analyze the kinds of things that their dad does. And then, with luck, they'll see it when he's doing it. They may tell you or they may not tell you. Children sometimes are fairly willing to criticize dad to mom if mom isn't very critical of dad. And I relate to this some from my own childhood. Now, my dad was not an abuser, but for other reasons, I didn't care for him very much. There are other ways to be an unpleasant person besides by being an abuser. And I remember that I could say, you know, my dad is this way, and my dad is this way, and my dad is this way. And if somebody else said, yeah, he sure is, I'd say, don't talk about my dad like that. And so you really want it to come from inside. And to some extent, I believe that you do have to correct misinformation. If he says, well, you know, dad says you're saying in court that he hit you and he never did, you can't just let that go by. You have to say something like, well, you know, he's not really supposed to be talking to you about what goes on in those court decisions, and I don't want to say anything bad to you about your dad, but I will assure you that I don't lie about him. You know, that kind of trying to frame things in the most diplomatic way that you can. But I've seen moms go to the other extreme, where they're so eager not to talk badly about him that they just keep letting all the stuff go by, and that's a problem also. It's a hard line to walk. It's a hard line to walk. We have a huge split, first of all, in Massachusetts between sort of theory and reality. The theory in Massachusetts, according to law, is that batterers are not supposed to get sole or joint custody of their children. If there's been a pattern of incidents of violence, or if there's been even one incident that was serious.
Is that a pattern? What's a pattern?
A pattern would be more than once, right? A number of times. It's not defined as whether it's 2 or 3 or 4. But a pattern or serious incident, in other words, it only takes one if it's defined as serious. Now, what's serious? Again, not clearly defined. There's a lot of judicial discretion, in Massachusetts mostly indiscretion, on those questions. And that if there has been a pattern or serious incident of violence, the court should consider placing restrictions on the batterer's visitation, either supervision or restricting his overnights, or putting various kinds of requirements on what he has to do in order to have that visitation, that he has to go to a batterer program, that he has to abstain from substance use, and so forth. So that's the theory. The reality in the state of Massachusetts is an absolute human rights disaster. And unfortunately, it's true in almost everywhere I go across the country, that batterers are routinely granted unsupervised contact regardless of serious reasons to be concerned for those children's psychological or sexual safety, sometimes even for their physical safety, that batterers are increasingly winning custody, and the court is refusing to take domestic violence seriously. The family law, the family courts are very heavily influenced by the Massachusetts Association of Guardians ad litem, which I used to be part of. I used to go to their conferences. I used to get their newsletter. I've written an article in their newsletter that somehow slipped through the cracks. And I know personally a fair number of the really influential people in the Massachusetts Associations of Guardians ad litem. Their attitudes are appalling. I can't put another word on it. So from a strategy standpoint, that's a whole other discussion. We have to, across the country, organize at the grassroots level massive protest movement against what is happening to battered women and, protective parents in general, in child custody, because it's not just battered women, it's also women whose children are being sexually abused by the dad, non-offending parents of incest perpetrators, and in occasional cases, it's a father where children are being sexually abused by the mom's new partner. The protective parent is much more often a mother than a father, but sometimes the protective parent, because of who tends to be the perpetrator of domestic violence and incest, but sometimes the protective parent is the dad. And so we need a huge protective parents movement across the country, and it's just beginning to build, but there's so much to do there. If anybody wants to get involved with that, talk to me about it, because it's really critical. And it's not going to be able to be done by being nice to people about it, unfortunately. We're going to have to really take it to the streets. Now, on a personal level, to try to survive a particular case, that's a whole other discussion that involves being able to pull together as much evidence as you can, who you can get, who's willing to testify on your behalf, whether you can afford a lawyer and find a lawyer who understands the abuse issues, because it's not about finding a lawyer who's a great divorce lawyer. This is one of the mistakes that people make. It's about finding a lawyer who specifically understands the abuse issues. It's about having that lawyer go with you to every meeting with an evaluator. They always need to be there. They need to watch evaluators like hawks. It's about a lawyer who's willing to put evaluators on the stand and very, very powerfully cross-examine them. It's about thinking long-term, because if you go in fighting too hard, the way the court system is currently stacked in Massachusetts, if you go in fighting too hard, it will actually count against you. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying, again, that's how it is. And so you have to go in very reasonable. You have to bend over backwards. You have to agree to things that you don't really think are good in order to try to keep the worst things from happening and try to wait for the abuser to unravel over time. And fortunately, if you play it strategically with a long-term view, very often the abuser will unravel over time. Some guys are good enough that they never will, but you just have to hope that he'll be in the category that eventually digs his own hole, or he gets tired of it and gives up. I'd be happy to talk to you more, after we're done tonight about your particular case, or if you're available to come tomorrow, I'd talk to you more then. But those are sort of some very basic concepts. When Dad Hurts Mom has a chapter specifically on pursuing your case in family court, it's with some good ideas in it. It's not an overwhelming flood of good ideas, because what we really need is social change. And unfortunately, I don't have any magic for someone's particular case, but there is a set of suggestions there. And I think you always want to combine that with trying to figure out, no matter what happens, how to keep your children well. Thank you.